Yes, welcome everyone to GeoHug. So I'm pumped to have Gregg Morrison here with us this week. So Gregg's a consultant and a trainer specializing in epithermal, porphyry and intrusion-related mineral systems. And he'll be chatting to us today on textural zoning in epithermal quartz veins. So thank you so much, Gregg, for joining us. It's wonderful having you.
You're welcome. Nice to be here. Yeah, I'm in semi-lockdown here in my office because the supercars are practicing today about a kilometre from where I'm sitting. So I had to try and build an isolation booth for myself to be able to talk to you, but I figured the headphones would probably work better. So here I am, despite the supercars, which we have the pleasure of having for 2 weeks because Victoria didn't want them because of the COVID danger. But people in Queensland don't worry about stuff like that. Anyway, what I'm going to talk about today is a couple of models that we've developed over the years. It's actually about 40 years now since we started doing this, but the two main things are using the observable textures in epithermal veins to build a texture zoning model that makes sense in relation to the genetic models that we have already for low sulfidation epithermals as represented in the famous Larry Buchanan model. What we did was add a textural model to that, and over the years I've found that works extremely well for navigating around low sulfidation epithermal systems, particularly those where boiling seems to be the main cause for mineralisation. The other thing we've done internally in a number of deposits is take them apart in terms of the relationship between the structure and the veins. And doing that initially at Pajingo, we found that there's a logical association between particular types of veins or styles of veins and where you are in relation to the extensional part of the structure particularly. So by recording those facies, as we call them, in logging, we can predict where the shoot's likely to be if we have a conceptual model for where things are. And that methodology has been used quite a lot in various parts of the world with a fair bit of success to have confidence about deciding where the next hole is to drill, because everybody that's worked in these kind of systems knows how easy it is to find the vein and how hard it is to find the good ore particularly. So we got into this story through floods in Alchemy and Springers. Originally, when we had an industry funded project at James Cook University, I took one of the students out to Woolgar, west of Townsville, in January, and we got stuck there in the floods. And so we thought, well, we're here in the camp, we can do something useful. So we logged all the core that we could get access to. And in doing that, we realized there was a systematic pattern in the various veins as to where the good stuff was. So we built that into a bigger project on the other deposits we were working on. And eventually we had quite a big team in that epithermal project, which was quite popular. I had 30 sponsors and a team of 10 or 12. And so we built similar models for quite a few deposits. And eventually we realized there were a lot of common features. And so we started to interpret what the fluids were doing with Subhash Jairath, who was in the team at the time, and Heather Johns, who was on the team, but is also a very talented artist. She thought we were talking alchemy when we were making those stories up. So she made a beautiful artwork that I still have on my wall that relates the textures that you might be able to see in the back of that middle picture in here to alchemy symbols. At the same time, when the project was really popular, my wife, who breeds Springer Spaniels, had a new litter, and so we decided to call them by quartz names. So we had agate and jasper and amethyst and Chelsea were the names of the dogs in that group. So there was a period there where we were all excited about epithermals. So let's sort of get into the real stuff. The first thing we did when we started that work was actually to follow a scheme that we'd already done for quartz in general, but just do it in more detail. And that is to classify the textures by their sort of genetic heritage. So we recognize primary textures that are the ones that initially fill the vein, if you like. There are textures, particularly in chalcedony, that relate to the conversion of the chalcedony to quartz to varying degrees. There are textures like the famous replacement, carbonate replacement textures that have blades in them, where carbonate and other soluble minerals are getting replaced by quartz. And then there's various kind of deformation textures, and epithermals, they're mainly tectonic and hydrothermal breccias are the most common thing. So on the right there are the sort of the formal names of the textures that we recognize, but I will, rather than discussing them all in detail here, I'll show them to you in the assemblages that make up the zoning model. So here's the textural part of that cartoon, and you can see there's 3 super zones marked out on the left, an upper chalcedony dominated zone, a central Crustiform-Colloform zone, and a deep zone that's crystal dominated. Within each of those, there are subtle variations. For example, in the chalcedonic zone, where you get carbonate in various forms commonly associated with the chalcedony. And as you go down in the chalcedonic zone, it becomes more and more banded and more recrystallized. So the subtle changes that allow you to define internal subzones in some way or another. Across here, there's a transition where the banding becomes more prominent. The banding here is generally fairly feeble, but in here it becomes obvious, and it generally represents an alternation between chalcedony and crystalline quartz. And so it combines textures that originate up here with ones that originate down here. And we divide this overall into 2 separate zones, an upper zone that's chalcedony dominated in the bands, in the number of bands, and a lower zone that's crystal dominated in the bands. This one tends to have lattice bladed texture and moss textured Adularia, which I'll show you examples of. This one tends to have needle form Adularia with sulfide bands and some disseminated or dispersed sulfides as well. Below that, the crystalline zone commonly has crude crustiform banding in its upper part with Adularia and some sulfides and can be mineralized. Whereas as you go deeper in that, you get out of the mineralized part particularly into just crystalline quartz, often with some carbonate that's crystalline rather than bladed. And that can have a crude crustiform sort of texture. So there's these chalcedonic, Crustiform-Colloform and crystalline zones within which there's a sort of a progression of textures, but a systematic distribution of those that makes sense. So I'll show you how that works after we have a look at a few examples. Here's the carbonates that you see commonly in epithermals. The one on the left has bands. You might be able to make out here a fine crystalline band. This one has euhedral crystals, and this one has blades in it. So even though that's a massive carbonate, it has a quite complex internal texture with variable types of carbonate that reflect slightly different conditions in a carbonate-dominated fluid. This one here is the sort of famous, if you like, bladed kind of calcite. This one is a manganose calcite, so it's slightly pink. And it has a rhombohedral shape, but it's elongated along the C-axis so that you can still see the rhomb on the end, but it's like a tablet, the shape. The bladed carbonate is the one that most people suggest indicates boiling in the hydrothermal system. So that in itself is a valuable characteristic to give you an idea where you are in the system. It's common to have other soluble phases with the same sort of characteristic. This is barite making up these sort of spindle-shaped crystals that are stacked in a sort of a kung fu kind of lattice. Both of these, all of these can be replaced by silica, and that's what gives the lattice bladed kind of texture. The trick is that when you replace these kind of tablets or these kind of spindles with quartz, the quartz sort of pseudomorphs the crystal pretty much wholesale, and so you can still see the shape of the original carbonate in it. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bladed textures that don't necessarily relate to replacement of original bladed carbonate. This one here, you can probably make out there are parallel zones in individual domains. These are actually individual big crystals that have been replaced along their cleavage by quartz, and then the intervening carbonate partly leached out to give these sort of zones of parallel blading. This is a classic kind of lattice, but it doesn't represent an original carbonate lattice. These are fracture fillings in the carbonate, and sometimes the cleavage planes in the carbonate that have been infilled with quartz, and then the intervening carbonate dissolved away. So how it works is you fill the crack with the fine-grained quartz, and then as you dissolve the carbon away, new quartz grows into the cavity that's produced. So that might happen in a boiling zone, but it doesn't have to. Up here, it's quite common in the weathering regime, for example. The other variant on that is to have a mold. That is the shape of the original crystal. This one's a fluorite with banded chalcedony on the outside. If you weather that fluorite away, you'll be left with these cubic cavities in the form of a mold. Here's the typical forms of chalcedony. A massive chalcedony, which is partially recrystallized gel, and it has a lot, often in thin section, it's completely dark because you're not seeing any structure, but in a lot of cases, you start seeing the odd crystal forming, and that's what the white speckles are through this. That recrystallization can take a lot of forms and can be a primary feature as well. That is that the recrystallization is going on at the same time that the chalcedony is precipitating. And it's precipitating in different forms. So it can be massive in one patch like it is there, or have this fibrous kind of growth like it does in this section. So you can see here, these are microlites of silica with fine irregular crystals on the outside of that and fine crystals outside that. But they're all fine enough that you can't see them in hand specimen. And that's usually the descriptive character of that kind of chalcedony. In veins, the chalcedony, we have almost entirely chalcedony internally. It can be very complicated. So different degrees of recrystallization represented by the gray versus the white. Nice colloform bands, and that can have bands of sulfide sort of anywhere in it, and breccias as well. So the trick with chalcedony is that because it starts off as a gel, it's fairly plastic until it's been recrystallized and a lot of the water's been driven off, so that it becomes more, has a better crystal structure and becomes more solid. The distinctive type of chalcedony that we find in the ore part of many deposits has what we call a hand specimen scale MOSS texture. And that is these little sort of millimeter size spheres, if you like, that in thin section are very distinct spheres. And there are plenty of pretty examples in the, in mineral collections around the world of this kind of thing on a grander scale. But this is the original colloidal gel crystallization form of the silica. Sometimes it can have an internal radiating texture like this, where fibers are growing, similar to in the plumose sort of texture. And overall, you see parts of it like here and the big sample that are grey. When you look at them in thin section, you realise that that is now mostly quartz, and that the chalcedony that's massive here, spherical here, is being consumed by the crystal. So what we've found is that when you're close to the boiling zone, there's quite a lot of recrystallization of the MOSS texture. And that's a good sign because it means there's additional fluid interacting with the original chalcedony. In the Crustiform-Colloform zone, the colloform is distinct from crustiform, but the ores have it all together. This is a classical colloform surface. This is chalcedony with rough, rounded upper surface that has a kidney-like form here. So that's a botryoidal form of silica. This one has the same colloform texture in this grey chalcedony, but the purple bands here are quartz crystals growing away from that surface. You can see the outlines of them in this band here. So the crustiform texture is this alternation between chalcedony and crystals in typical samples like that. Here's one with manganocalcite with beautiful colloform texture and some dark, very fine sulfide bands around it. Crystalline quartz in here, more carbonate, base metal sulfides, and chalcedony down here. So it's colloform in here, it's crustiform between that band and this band, and it's ore with distinct concentration of sulfide in bands. They can be bold like this one or very delicate ones like you see internally here. Okay, the crystalline quartz can be any grain size, but it's most often clear and fine in epithermals. It can be like this, sugary or saccharoidal kind of quartz that's sort of anhedral grains that are partly interlocking and have some cavities in between. That can be comb textured like these ones. You can see this, the crystals are competing for space here. That's why that one has a wedge shape. And these ones have these alternating colors that are zones. The background here is amethyst. The white zones have high concentrations of fluid inclusions, which reflects a change in the fluid character from that which produced the more typical gray quartz in here. So that's a crystal that's growing under boiling conditions where the fluid's changing from liquid dominant to gas dominant on a regular sort of basis. They can be incredibly complex internally, those things, and quite delicate zones. When you're deeper in the crystalline zone, but still in the mineralization, it's all made up of equant crystals, and it can have sort of crude bands of sulfide in it like this one does. This sort of texture in typical low sulfidation epithermals is generally mineralized, but not necessarily ore. But in intermediate sulfidation, this sort of thing is often the dominant textural variety of the veins, and the sulfides contain silver mineral, silver sulfur salts, or silver with galena that make these generally more silver-rich ores than gold-rich ores. There's plenty of barren, fine crystalline quartz. This is internally, might be a little bit hard to see, but this is fundamentally fibrous quartz internally here. This is part of the barren zone that we see commonly around ore shoots in quite a lot of places. Just some comments on some other things. So they're the three main zones outlined, but there are a few other things that are pertinent here. One is that sinter, for me, is the surface expression of the chalcedonic zone. That is, the sinter is made out of chalcedony, and it's porous because it's aerated and because it's got organic matter growing in amongst it. So here's the Champagne Pool at Waitapu. This is the famous antimony precipitate with all the gold in it. And here's the nice sort of ripple texture. So the water is spilling over and precipitating quartz along the edge here. The interesting thing is that a lot of sinter has an internal texture, a moss texture. And when you look at things like this antimony precipitate with all the gold in it, the antimony oxide also has a colloidal kind of texture. And it's a popular idea at the moment that the formation of colloids under these sort of conditions is a significant precipitator of other things besides silica, including gold. Here's the variations in Adularia. Typical Adularia is this rhombic crystalline form that's usually orange or pink with a bit of hematite staining in it. But this is needle-shaped Adularia in colloform bands. It's been actually replaced by kaolinite, which has been etched out when the sample was cut, and the gaps are filled in with grinding powder here, which highlights the texture. This is, there's a band of Adularia here, and there's Adularia within this that's a bit hard to distinguish from the chalcedony, but all of that is moss textured, and these are crystalline zones in here. So Adularia can adopt a typical texture of each of the Chalcedonic, Crustiform-Colloform and crystalline zones, but the most common one is this one here, but the best mineralized one is usually the moss textured Adularia in my experience. Breccias and epithermals are mainly hydrothermal when they're in the ore zone. That is, there's repeated brecciation by the same fluids that are forming the mineralization in the first place. So it's common to see that the class, and here these are wall rock class that have been silicified and have bands of fine crystals and sulfide in the actual class, and then there's an infill of new bands of sulfide and silica and late infill silica. So the quartz and the alteration in the class is often texturally quite similar to the infill, just that there's the sulfide's a bit more obvious here in the overgrowth in the coccaids here. Here's a similar one here. This one's from Pajingo. These are beautifully banded class with very delicate sulfide bands in them, overgrown by moss Adularia, and then infill with crystalline quartz and more Adularia. And those have, in here particularly, have sulfide bands as well. So this and this aren't fundamentally different. So they occur in the same place in the mineralized zone. Typical ores and epithermals. These are just sort of examples from the different zones, if you like. We'll start at shallow and go to deep. So this is an example out of the Chalcedonic zone where we've got chalcedony in the background, and this is marcasite that's inverting to bladed pyrite. This marcasite has internal, it's colloform, but it's also spheroidal form, whereas these are growing crystals. So the marcasite's being recrystallized to pyrite. The marcasite, I've studied the sample in a bit of detail. The marcasite here has about 10 grams of gold in it, but it's in the lattice of the marcasite. But when it recrystallizes like this, the gold actually becomes very fine free particles on the edge of the pyrite grains. So the recrystallization is liberating the gold to a degree, but it's still quite hard to get out of that pyrite because it's so fine grained. But that's common in the chalcedony zone to have pyrite marcasite as the dominant minerals. Here's one out of the upper Crustiform-Colloform zone with manganocalcite and chalcedony and crystalline quartz, and beautiful black, delicate sulfide bands with a lot of visible gold. You should probably see it in there. that's just crowded with visible gold. I think it is a thing in veins that have carbonate, that it's much more common to see free gold, often with base metal sulfides rather than sulfose salts. Certainly where this comes from, that is the case, and a number of other places I've seen that too. Here's a classical ginguro from Karangahaki. Here's chalcedony, crystalline quartz with some sulfide in it. Banded chalcedony with a delicate sulfide band, crystals of quartz and a comb texture with prominent sulfide along the edge here. And that band is the ginguro band. When you analyze samples like this, that has nothing, that has grade, and that has high grade. That is, the gold is intimately associated with the sulfides, even when it's free, like it is in this sample. Okay, so that's in the middle of the Crustiform-Colloform zone, where you've got roughly equal amounts of chalcedony and crystalline quartz. In the deeper part and in the transition into the crystalline zone, here we have wall rock fragments with alteration and little veins with Adularia and crystalline quartz in them, overgrowth of sulfide, and a late infill of fine crystalline quartz. So the cockade represents the same textural zone as you see in the veins. It just happens to be in a breccia. And here's the one we were talking about before that's just dominated by crystals. Okay, so there can be ore in all of those different textural varieties, but the reality is that this one tends to be with pyrite and arsenical pyrite and be refractory. The ones with manganocalcite tend to have free gold along with sulfose salts and sulfides. The ginguros tend to have sulfose salts dominant. The ones with crystalline quartz alone without chalcedony tend to have quite good base metal sulfides, and the crystalline ones have base metal sulfides where often the silver dominates over the gold. Okay, so the best place to be is in the Crustiform-Colloform zone, as sort of everybody knows, but you can find mineralisation and even ore in other parts of it, depending a little bit on exactly what kind of system you're in. Okay, so what does all that mean? We go back to the original cartoon. Here's our crystal zones. So we've got the three super zones, the Chalcedonic, the Crustiform-Colloform, and the Crystalline. Stuck on Larry Buchanan's diagram with the alteration, the temperature of formation based on fluid inclusions, and the metal association that's been interpreted from the mineralogy. And what we realized about the texture, which was a eureka moment where the alchemy was being discussed, is that chalcedony fundamentally forms from gas-dominated part of the overall fluid and above the boiling zone. And carbonate tends to be preserved up there as well because the CO2 partitions into that gas. It might originate in the boiling zone, but it gets preserved up here better. And the fugacity of carbon dioxide is a lot higher in here than it is in here generally. Within the boiling zone, you have gas and liquid, but you have that progressive segregation between gas and liquid that fundamentally leads to a liquid dominated zone below, and within the boiling zone itself, ultimately a predominance of liquid in the lower part and gas in the upper part. And that's why there's this logical progression through all of those, because the real action happens in here, the gas goes up, the liquid goes down, and the characteristics that are present in here are also partially present in the zones above and below. So the attraction of that is, and the way that I've used this is to say, if I find that my veins are all chalcedonic but banded and they have anomalous gold in them, then the chances are that underneath that is a Crustiform-Colloform zone that should have better gold in it. Whereas if I sample in the Crustiform-Colloform zone, which should have the good stuff and it doesn't, then I'm a bit pessimistic about that zone. And if I have a dominant crystal zone with mineralization, and I'm either in an intermediate sulfidation system where those crystals might persist down a bit, and that's usually characterized by them having a multi-element kind of geochemistry, or as they do at Pajingo, for example, the Adularian sulfide gradually fade out into crystalline quartz and the grade disappears. Okay, so there's a natural relationship between the texture zoning model and the way fluids behave in boiling zones under this sort of idealized single pass kind of condition. So it's a model. I don't take it seriously. I take it as a framework for interpreting what I'm looking at any particular point. And if the relationships between the different textural varieties make sense and the grade distribution makes sense, then I build my own model for that particular deposit that I'm working on. Here's some examples of what we've done, sort of progressively how we've improved the methodology. This is from several generations of work at Pajingo. At Pajingo, you have mafic volcanics up here in green, sediments here which overlie the volcanics, and a set of rhyolitic, rhyodacite domes that intrude the sediments and the volcanics. What the guys here have done is map out the distribution of the dominant textures in various drill holes and surface samples. And fundamentally, the blues are the crystalline ones, the greens are the Crustiform-Colloform, and the reds and yellows are sinter and the Chalcedonic silica. Okay, so there's a fundamental progression. That's the boundary to basement there and here, by the way. Crystalline stuff in the deeper part of the volcanics, progressively into Crustiform-Colloform in here, and into sinters and chalcedony out here in the sediments and in and around the domes as well. It's quite clear at Pajingo that the mineralization is preferentially developed in the andesitic volcanics, but it's genetically related to the rhyolite domes. And that's because I think it's a common characteristic that the mafic volcanics are a better host both chemically and mechanically. So it's clear in Vera-Nancy that a lot of the alterations controlled by the difference between lavas and fragmentals. So the main zone of mineralization is through here. There's probably all up with some of the new thing that's being developed out here, about 5 million ounces in that zone, of which over 3 has been mined already, particularly in this segment here. Our original work at Pajingo was on the Scott Lobe, which is up at the northwest end, in the thesis by Renato Bobbis. And what was obvious there is the typical epithermal thing, which was part of the original discovery, that, you have a central quartz vein with a siliceous alteration envelope, and then a clay alteration envelope around that. These things in this part of the world, because of tropical weathering, the quartz things stick out of the ground quite well and they're quite easy to see. And the argillic stuff is recessive relative to propylitic alteration. So there's topography associated with being in that position. The discovery there was by a Kiwi who had seen epithermal veins elsewhere and was one of the first to make a fuss about it in this part of the world. And that set off the whole, a big exploration effort that included the project that we did at JCU. So that's easy enough to understand, but when we looked at the textures where along the whole lode and long section, we realized that The ore chute, the part that's worth mining, is at where there's a bend in the overall structure rather than an intersection. It's essentially a curved structure. And the distinctive thing is that the textures change dramatically going into that structure. So the grey on either side here is crystalline quartz with a fibrous and crustiform habit, and it's essentially unmineralized. In the main zone, there's an upper and lower part. The top part has chalcedonic and moss textures dominant, has a lot of sulfide bands. The lower part has crustiform and colloform textures with about equal amounts of crystals and chalcedony, but a lot of internal breccia. So the best grade is actually in this part of it here, particularly where there's breccias, but the whole thing fades out going down into a zone that goes back into crystalline quartz with Adularia. Okay, so there's a very distinctive characteristic, particularly the development of crustiform-colloform textures in the ore chute. And so that's a bit of a revelation. The next step in that process was during the exploration in Vera-Nancy. It took 20 years from the development of the Scott lode and the mining of the Scott lode for about 900,000 ounces to finding mineable material in the Vera-Nancy structure. Even though that now is the major producer, it demonstrates how difficult it is to actually find good stuff, even when you have good intersections. What we realized when we were looking at the parts of it that were drilled out and mined is that you could map out different parts of the overall structure. So this part here is what we'd call a lode that includes a variety of deformed rocks, altered rocks, and veins, and different styles of veins. And in this case, particularly, it was quite valuable to demonstrate that the distribution of those different kind of characteristics within that overall structure made a lot of sense in relation to a normal fault model with some sinistral displacement on it. That is, we could recognize features that relate to the different components of a sort of an idealized model. So while we were doing this, Brett Davies, not Davis, did a structural interpretation. The two married beautifully to help us understand what was going on. So these are just some quick pictures of some of the textures of those different zones. Here's the cataclasite, the sheared up illite altered rock that becomes a tectonic breccia with fragments of veins as well as of the variably altered and part silicified rock. And it gets some overprint by squibby little veins, but often not very many and quite narrow sort of structure. The next zone in that model is where you have black silica-sulfide replacing the rock flour matrix in the cataclasite, and then it gets overprinted by a often very weird network of veins. So a little bit hard to see the cataclastic texture in here, but it's quite distinct from the type of hydrothermal breccias you see, which tend to have much more distinct equant clasts. And here with silica and illite alteration, but still have a silica-sulfide matrix. So this matrix and that matrix can be quite similar, but the form of the breccia, this one's tectonic and this one's hydrothermal. Here's the stringer or sheeted veins that you tend to find above the sort of the rollover in the structure. And those progress down and amalgamate into horsetail veins. So you see this kind of asymmetry here where you have these curved veins linked to other steep veins. And when you map that out, it's essentially the point of rollover where the structure's opening up and the steep veins are interconnecting with shallower veins. And here's the end point of all that, the big massive vein. This is underground at Pajingo on Vera South, which was one of the very rich veins. Maybe a little bit hard to see, but it has quite good banding overall. It has a big blob of breccia here with a sort of a tail around it. It has a lot of finer breccia in it. And it has a lot of sulfide bands and some wall rock shears in it, like here. The thing that you learn very quickly when you work on these things underground is that it's almost impossible to predict the grade. There were several research projects that accompanied the normal, work, day-to-day work, and they demonstrated that on a 10 centimetre by 10 centimetre basis, the grade can go from nothing to 100 grams. And even though you would like to think that the good stuff is always with the sulfide bands, it isn't in there. And a lot of it, the gold is very fine and in sulfide-free bands. So what it means is that in places like this, from face to face, from bench to bench, you can't predict what the overall grade is. At Pajingo, in this phase, when I was there, the mill results were put back to be an average for what was mined from that particular heading. And that was built into a model of the grade distribution, but overall it's incredibly erratic. So what we were able to do with that Facies modeling is to review all the occurrences that were part of the exploration and mining and build the models of the silica-sulfide versus stringers versus stockworks versus massive veins, and look at the shape of that and relate it to the structural model. So here's one of the interesting ones. This was Vera. It was called Vera originally, but when it was drilled deeper, another zone was found underneath that called Vera South, which turned out to be the very best part of the mine. And the distinctive thing about that is that this is still open going downwards. In fact, the stockworks and breccias are coming back in here. So when this steepens up again, there could easily be another chute down here. So this was a revelation in the predictability of it structurally, but also a revelation in terms of the overall model. And that is that in the Larry Buchanan model, the cause of boiling is venting the fluid to surface. But in here, which is clearly underground and clearly stacked and without any necessary connection to surface, you can actually create boiling by having a structure that opens in that sense and decompresses the fluid, and that decompression causes it to boil. So in here, I think this is like a set of poppet beads where you have an opening chute here, an opening chute here, an opening chute here. So you can end up with a kilometre of vertical extent within a vein that, according to the original model, should only be a couple of 100 metres deep. So that was a big thing, and that opened up the possibility within Pajingo of exploring deeper through the whole system. You might be able to make out along here, these are models similar to this one for each of the main zones, and we use those to evaluate the depth potential underneath the whole Vera-Nancy system. That's been done. That same methodology has been applied in a number of places where I've worked and been extremely valuable as a predictive tool. I just put this in because I like it so much. This is the Bonanza ore from Fruta del Norte in Ecuador. This is the part of the intersection of 15 meters at 331 grams, where the good stuff is all through this. There's plenty in the sulfides and these sort of breccia zones, but there's a lot of free gold in that's part of a essentially Crustiform-Colloform Chalcedony dominated vein with quite a bit of manganocalcite. That's all gold there. This is a mixture of sulfides dominated by pyrite and sphalerite. So that bonanza is made up of these in amongst a whole bunch of other little zones within that vein that are very well mineralized. And just to make your day, here's 3 examples of bonanza stuff that I've visited or worked on. Anyway, there's that same sample from Fruta del Norte. Here's one from Quinchana at Gosawong. These are ginguro bands, but this sample has about 3% gold in it. And this is a sample from Sleeper in Nevada. That is, it's hard to see the chalcedony here, but it's fundamentally chalcedony with colloidal bands. This is the sort of material that Jim Saunders worked on when he demonstrated that the gold formed in a colloidal form back in the late 80s. That's now a sort of a popular model for those things. So the distinctive thing about these 3 bonanza things that I didn't really appreciate until I put them side by side is that they're all Crustiform-Colloform and all in the upper Chalcedonic part of the Crustiform-Colloform zone. And I think in low sulfidation epithermals, that's not an unusual thing in terms of position in the zoning model. I put this slide in because I thought we might have this conversation a bit. If you're willing, I could spend a couple of minutes on it. And that is the difference between low, intermediate and high sulfidation things in terms of their textural and geochemical characteristics. So, and this is very simple and crude, but it's a simple way of telling the difference. And in our boiling zone ones, the Crustiform-Colloform zone is diagnostic. And you tend to get, gold more than silver with sulfur salts and base metals. And the relationship to the intrusions is often not very clearly defined. They're often there in the structure, but there's no real pattern of spatial relationship or zoning that relates to proximity to the intrusion, for example. In intermediate sulfidation deposits like the Mexican ones, for example, my impression is that quite a lot of those, they're dominated by crystalline textures and crustiform and tend not to have big amounts of chalcedony in them. They can have a carbonate top, but chalcedony is generally not that common. And they tend to have quite a lot of base metals and often silver greater than gold. And when they're drilled out, very often there's underlying porphyry system of some sort. It doesn't mean there's a big porphyry copper deposit. It may be just that there's, there's some semblance of a porphyry hydrothermal system under there. In high sulfidation things, I think silica-sulfide is dominant, carbonate's very uncommon, and sulfosalts are very prominent. So are things like tellurides. And the relationship to the intrusions is nearly always fairly straightforward. That new work at the new stuff that's been published on Mount Carlton by the guys from JCU is a really good example of all those relationships sort of worked out and demonstrated quite well. None of this is to suggest that, that these are all unique and always separate. It's just the predominant, I'm just trying to demonstrate that the predominant characteristics are different, mainly because the relationship to the intrusions is different from in those 3. Okay, so I wanted to sort of leave that there to enjoy, but really all I've been trying to say is that if we use the textural zoning model to figure out where we are and navigate our way through a low sulfidation epithermal system, we can be crudely predictive of where the good stuff is. And if we use a Facies model like the one I've illustrated from Pajingo, we can link that to the structure and predict where the next one's going to be. So that combination has proven over the years to be quite a powerful way of evaluating these systems. There's a list of references that includes Dowling and Morrison from 1988, which was the original work we did on all the quartz in northeast Queensland, and that methodology of separating out the different environments. So that exists, and I've given a lot of workshops on that. Overall, as a reconnaissance tool, it's fantastic for deciding where you are.
Thank you so much.